The darkness was absolute. November 15, 1942, 1 minute past midnight in the waters north of Guadalcanal. Captain Glenn Davis stood on the bridge of USS Washington, watching his entire task force disintegrate around him. 3 destroyers were already gone, Walk, Preston, and Benham, torn apart by Japanese shells and torpedoes in a matter of minutes. The 4th destroyer, Gwin, was crippled and limping away. USS South Dakota, the only other battleship in his force, had suffered a catastrophic electrical failure and was now absorbing punishment from what seemed like every Japanese gun in the Pacific. And Washington was alone. Alone, facing a Japanese fleet that outnumbered her 6-1. 1 battleship. 2 heavy cruisers. 2 light cruisers. 9 destroyers. All of them hunting in the pitch-black waters between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, in a channel the Americans had grimly nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound for all the ships already resting on its floor. But Captain Davis had something the Japanese did not. Something that would cause a Japanese staff officer named Toshikazu Ami to write, years later, words that would echo through naval warfare forever. The employment of radar by the United States completely reversed the Japanese Navy's traditional superiority in night engagements. On this night, in these waters, everything the Japanese Navy believed about itself, about their spiritual superiority, their tactical dominance in darkness, their inevitable victory, was about to shatter like the hull of the Kurashima under Washington's guns. This is the story of how one American battleship, armed with 9 16-inch guns and a technology the enemy could barely comprehend, faced an entire fleet in the darkness and won. But more than that, it's the story of what came after, the moment when Japanese naval officers, reading the after-action reports, began to understand the true scale of American industrial might and what it meant for the war they thought they were winning. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 3 months earlier, on August 7, 1942, United States Marines had stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, a malarial speck of jungle in the Solomon Islands that most Americans had never heard of. Their objective was an airfield the Japanese were building, a strip of coral and compacted earth that would become the most contested real estate in the Pacific War. The Americans named it Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. The Japanese called it their absolute priority to destroy. By mid-November, the Guadalcanal campaign had devolved into something unprecedented in modern warfare, a grinding, attritional struggle that neither side could afford to lose and neither side seemed able to win. The Marines on Guadalcanal were besieged, half-starved, racked with malaria and dysentery. The Japanese were even worse off, their supply lines strangled by American airpower operating from Henderson Field during daylight hours. But at night, when the American planes were grounded, Japanese destroyers raced down the slot, the channel through the Solomon Islands, delivering supplies and reinforcements in runs the Americans called the Tokyo Express. The Japanese had tried everything. On October 13, 2 battleships, Haruna and Kongo, had bombarded Henderson Field, firing 918 rounds of 14-inch ammunition in 80 minutes. The bombardment destroyed 42 aircraft and set fuel dumps ablaze. The Marines called it the Night of the Battleships. But Henderson Field remained operational. Engineers filled the craters. Surviving aircraft flew missions the next morning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, understood what Guadalcanal meant. He reportedly told Vice Admiral Mikawa, "The situation on Guadalcanal Island is very serious, much more serious than that which the Japanese confronted in the Russo-Japanese War when they had to occupy Port Arthur before the approach of the Baltic Fleet to Far Eastern waters." Yamamoto was right to worry. Guadalcanal was bleeding the Japanese Navy white, destroyers sunk, cruisers crippled, aircraft carriers damaged, pilots killed who could not be replaced. Each engagement cost ships and men that Japan's limited industrial capacity could not reproduce at the speed America could. But Yamamoto would try one more time. In early November, he authorized a major operation to deliver 7,000 troops from the 38th Infantry Division to Guadalcanal, supported by 11 large transport ships and a powerful surface fleet. The transports would land the troops. The warships would pulverize Henderson Field into rubble. And this time, they would succeed. Vice Admiral Abe Hiroaki led the first wave on the night of November 12 to 13. Two battleships, Hai and Kurashima, escorted by 14 other warships, approached Guadalcanal laden with special fragmentation shells designed to shred aircraft on the ground and kill personnel. The Americans detected them coming. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, with 2 light cruisers, 3 heavy cruisers, and 8 destroyers, steamed to intercept. What followed was chaos. 24 minutes of point-blank savagery in the darkness, ships firing at ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. The cruiser Atlanta was disabled immediately, her hull punctured by Japanese torpedoes and friendly fire. 4 American destroyers, Cushing, Laffey, Barton, and Monson, were sunk. The destroyer Udachi was sent to the bottom. The battleship Hai, pounded by shells from multiple ships, suffered catastrophic damage and was scuttled the next day after American aircraft from Henderson Field finished her off. But the most significant casualty was Rear Admiral Callahan himself, killed on the bridge of the San Francisco when Japanese shells tore through the superstructure. Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, also killed that night, became the only 2 flag officers of the United States Navy to die in a surface engagement during the entire war. The Japanese had been turned back. Henderson Field was saved. But at a terrible cost, 2 admirals dead, 2 cruisers sunk, 4 destroyers lost, over 1,400 American sailors killed. And the Japanese were not finished. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, commander of the Japanese Second Fleet, regrouped his forces. On the night of November 14, he would try again. This time, the bombardment force centered on the battleship Kurashima, a veteran of every major engagement since Pearl Harbor, a ship that had helped sink the American destroyer Edsel in March, had bombarded Midway Island in preparation for the invasion, had screened the carrier force at the Battle of Midway itself. Kurashima and her escorts would steam into Iron Bottom Sound, demolish Henderson Field with their main batteries, and allow the transports to land their troops the next morning. Admiral William Halsey, commander of American forces in the South Pacific, was scraping the bottom of the barrel. The carrier Enterprise had been damaged in the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands 2 weeks earlier and was barely operational. Most of his cruisers were either sunk or under repair. His destroyer force was decimated. But Halsey had 2 assets left, 2 brand-new fast battleships that had been escorting the Enterprise, USS Washington and USS South Dakota. USS Washington, BB-56, had been commissioned in May 1941 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. She was a North Carolina-class battleship, 729 feet long, displacing 35,000 tons, capable of 28 knots. Her main battery consisted of 9 16-inch guns mounted in 3 triple turrets, guns capable of hurling an 1,800-pound armor-piercing shell over 20 miles. Her secondary armament included 25-inch dual-purpose guns, organized in 10 twin mounts, effective against both surface targets and aircraft. She was armored to withstand punishment from 14-inch guns, with a main belt 16 inches thick at its maximum and an armored deck 5 inches thick. But Washington's most important weapon wasn't her guns or her armor. It was her Mark III fire control radar, mounted atop her forward main battery director. This radar could detect surface targets at ranges exceeding 30,000 yards, over 17 miles, and provide accurate range and bearing data for her guns in complete darkness or through smoke. The Mark III was primitive by later standards, with a circular cathode ray tube display that showed contacts as glowing points of light, but in November 1942 it was revolutionary technology. And the man who would command Washington in battle was perhaps the only admiral in the United States Navy who truly understood what that technology meant. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr., known to his friends as Ching, was 54 years old in November 1942. A 1908 graduate of the Naval Academy, Lee had spent decades advocating for the modernization of American warships. He had served as director of fleet training and had become the Navy's foremost expert on radar and its tactical applications. Before the war, when radar was still experimental and poorly understood, Lee had insisted on equipping ships with the devices and training officers to use them. He reportedly knew more about radar than the radar operators. Lee was also an Olympic gold medalist. At the 1920 Games in Antwerp, he had won 5 gold medals and 1 silver in shooting, the most decorated American athlete at those games. His marksmanship extended beyond rifles. He understood gunnery at a fundamental level, the mathematics of trajectory, the physics of ballistics, the psychology of staying calm while everything around you exploded. On the afternoon of November 13, Lee received orders from Halsey, take Washington, South Dakota, and 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwin, and stop the Japanese bombardment force. Lee would have complete freedom of action. Halsey trusted him to make the right decisions in the chaos of night battle. But there was a problem. Lee's task force was a scratch team thrown together hours before the battle. The destroyer captains had never worked with Lee. Washington and South Dakota had barely operated together. The 2 battleships had only fired their main batteries at night a handful of times in training. Washington had done it twice, in January 1942. South Dakota had fired 3 times total, never at night. They were steaming into a night engagement against a force that outnumbered them, in confined waters littered with wrecks and reefs, with destroyer captains who didn't know their admirals' tactics and battleship crews who had never fired their guns together in darkness. The Japanese, by contrast, were the masters of night fighting. They had trained for it relentlessly. Their long lance torpedoes, capable of traveling 24 miles at 48 knots with warheads carrying over 1,000 pounds of explosives, were the most lethal in the world. Their optical equipment was superior. Their destroyer crews were veterans of dozens of nighttime engagements. Admiral Lee knew all of this. On the afternoon of November 14, as his task force steamed north toward Guadalcanal, he addressed his crew over the ship's loudspeaker system. His message was characteristically blunt. According to accounts, he told them they were going into a night surface action against a superior Japanese force. He told them the odds. He told them what was expected. And he told them they would win, because they had radar and the Japanese did not. At 2100 hours, 9 p.m., Lee's 6 ships entered Iron Bottom Sound. They steamed in column formation, the 4 destroyers in front, Walk, Benham, Preston, Gwin, followed by South Dakota, with Washington bringing up the rear. Lee positioned his flagship last deliberately. If the destroyers made contact first, Washington would be far enough back to use her radar without being blinded by muzzle flashes from her own forward guns. The night was moonless. Visibility was measured in yards. The only illumination came from stars obscured by clouds and the faint phosphorescence of the tropical sea. To the south, Guadalcanal was a dark mass against a darker sky. To the north, Savo Island loomed, a volcanic cone where, for months earlier, the Japanese had sunk 4 American heavy cruisers in the Battle of Savo Island. The waters between were a graveyard. Somewhere below the keels of Lee's ships lay the wrecks of the Atlanta, the Juno, the destroyers sunk just 2 nights before. Lee's force made a clockwise arc north of Savo, radar sweeping continuously. At 2210 hours, the Japanese light cruiser Sendai spotted the American column and reported it to Admiral Kondo. The Japanese were approaching in 3 groups, a distant screen of the light cruiser Sendai and 3 destroyers under Rear Admiral Hashimoto, a close screen of the light cruiser Nagara and 6 destroyers under Rear Admiral Kimura, and Kondo's main bombardment group, the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, the battleship Kurashima, and 2 more destroyers. At 2300 hours, 11 p.m., Washington's radar detected Japanese ships to the north. Admiral Lee ordered his force to come right, steering southwest. The range closed. Japanese and American warships were converging in the darkness, each side aware the other was there but neither able to see the enemy clearly. At 2317 hours, the destroyer Walk, leading the American column, opened fire with her 5-inch guns. Tracers arced through the night. Seconds later, Benham and Preston joined in, firing at radar contacts and visual sightings of Japanese destroyers. The battle had begun. Admiral Kondo, realizing he faced American battleships, decided to swamp them with destroyers. Admiral Hashimoto's group, Sendai and 3 destroyers, turned north behind a smoke screen. Washington's radar tracked them anyway, plotting their course through the smoke. But Hashimoto's other two destroyers, Uranami and Ayanami, continued closing on the American column. The American destroyers were outmatched. Japanese destroyers were larger, faster, better armed, and carried the long lance torpedoes. At 2,322 hours, torpedoes began hitting the American ships. Preston took a torpedo in her engineering spaces and lost power. Shells from Japanese cruisers and destroyers ripped through her superstructure. She was sinking. Walk, the lead destroyer, was hit by multiple shells and a torpedo. Fires erupted. Her ammunition began cooking off. She exploded and sank at 2,333 hours. Benham took a torpedo in her bow, which blew off 60 feet of her forward section. Gwyn was damaged but still maneuvering. In 15 minutes, Admiral Lee had lost 3/4 of his destroyer screen. Preston sank at 2,343 hours with most of her crew. Benham was dead in the water, her bow shattered. Only Gwyn remained combat effective, and she was pulling back to the south. Behind the destroyers, USS South Dakota was having problems of her own. At 2,322 hours, her electrical system failed catastrophically. A series of short circuits, possibly caused by damage from near-miss shells, possibly from the shock of firing her own guns, knocked out power throughout the ship. Her radar went dark. Her fire control systems went offline. Her main battery turrets lost power traverse. For critical minutes, South Dakota was blind and nearly helpless, steaming through a battle she couldn't see, relying on manual backups and emergency lighting. As South Dakota's crew frantically worked to restore power, the ship blundered closer to the Japanese formation. At approximately 2,350 hours, power was partially restored. South Dakota's radar flickered back to life. But she was now dangerously close to Admiral Kondo's main force, too close. The Japanese spotted her. Kirishima's searchlights snapped on, illuminating South Dakota's hull. Instantly, every Japanese ship in range opened fire. Atago's 8-inch guns. Takau's 8-inch guns. Kirishima's 14-inch main battery. Destroyers with 5-inch guns. The Japanese had loaded their guns with bombardment ammunition, high-explosive shells with impact fuses, designed to detonate on contact and create blast effects rather than penetrate armor. They were the wrong ammunition for fighting battleships, but at close range they were devastating nonetheless. South Dakota took hit after hit. Her superstructure was riddled. Her radar antennas were shot away. Fires erupted on her upper works. A 14-inch shell from Kirishima struck South Dakota's main gun director, killing or wounding everyone inside. Another 14-inch shell destroyed a 5-inch gun mount, killing the entire crew. South Dakota's captain, Captain Thomas Gatch, was knocked unconscious by the blast. The ship's executive officer took command, ordering evasive maneuvers and trying to break away from the Japanese fire. South Dakota was being systematically dismantled. Her topside was a mass of flames and wreckage. 39 men were dead. 59 were wounded. If the Japanese had been firing armor-piercing shells instead of bombardment rounds, South Dakota would have been sunk. As it was, she was out of the fight, turning south to escape, her guns silent, her crew fighting fires and dragging wounded men from shattered gun mounts. And on the bridge of USS Washington, trailing a mile and a half behind South Dakota, Admiral Lee watched it all on radar. Washington had not yet fired a shot. Lee had held fire deliberately, using Washington's superior radar to track the developing battle. He had watched his destroyers die on the scope. He had tracked South Dakota's erratic course as she struggled with electrical failures. And now he watched as every Japanese ship concentrated fire on South Dakota, illuminating her with searchlights, pounding her with shells. Which meant the Japanese had forgotten about Washington. From Washington's radar plot, Lee could see the entire tactical picture. The Japanese formation was spread out, individual ships silhouetted against the fires on South Dakota. Kirishima was at 8,400 yards, less than 5 miles, almost point-blank range for 16-inch guns. She was broadside to Washington, every gun firing at South Dakota, her crew fixated on the illuminated target. Washington's radar had been tracking Kirishima for several minutes, feeding range and bearing data to the Mark III fire control computer. Washington's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Harvey Walsh, had a perfect firing solution. 9 16-inch guns were loaded with armor-piercing shells, shells designed to penetrate armor plate and explode deep inside an enemy ship. At exactly midnight, 0000 hours on November 15, Washington opened fire. The first salvo of 3 shells screamed across the darkness at 2,500 feet per second. Flight time to target, 13 seconds. The shells came down at a steep angle, plunging through Kirishima's deck armor. One hit, possibly two. Kirishima's hull rang like a bell as 1,800 pounds of steel traveling at supersonic speed punched through her plating and detonated inside. 15 seconds later, Washington fired again. For the next 2 minutes and 39 seconds, Washington fired on ready light, firing as fast as each turret could load and train, pouring shells into Kirishima at a rate that appalled even Washington's own crew. Turret 1, Turret 2, Turret 3, rotating, elevating, firing, recoiling, loading. The noise was apocalyptic. Each 16-inch gun discharged with a blast that rattled teeth and hammered eardrums even through protective gear. The muzzle flash was so bright it bleached color from everything, turning the night into a strobing black and white photograph. The pressure wave from each salvo blew outward across the water, creating circular ripples visible on radar. The shells ripped Kirishima apart. One struck her pagoda mast, the towering superstructure that housed her bridge and fire control stations. The bridge became an inferno. Another shell penetrated her forward 14-inch turret and detonated inside. The turret was blown off the barbette, its 2 guns permanently silenced. A third shell hit near the waterline, flooding compartments below the armor belt. Then another. And another. Japanese officers on Kirishima's bridge tried to return fire, but they had no target. Washington was too far away to see, hidden in darkness, her muzzle flashes obscured by the smoke and glare from South Dakota's burning superstructure. Kirishima's optical rangefinders were useless. Her crews fired blindly into the night, hoping to hit something, hitting nothing. Washington's gunnery officer requested star shells, illumination rounds fired by the 5-inch secondary battery to light up the target. 62 star shells were fired during the engagement, turning night into flickering day as parachute flares drifted down, casting stark shadows across the water. Under that artificial illumination, Washington's gunners watched their shells strike home. Kirishima was ablaze stem to stern, listing, her forward section a mass of explosions and fire. After 2 minutes and 39 seconds, Washington ceased fire. An erroneous report had reached the bridge that Kirishima had sunk. She hadn't, not yet, but she was dying. A minute and a half later, Washington resumed firing, unleashing another 2 minutes and 45 seconds of sustained bombardment. By the time Washington's guns went silent for the second time, she had fired 75 16-inch shells and over 45-inch shells at Kirishima. The official action report would later estimate that at least 9 16-inch shells hit Kirishima. Most historians believe the number was closer to 20. Either number was catastrophic. Kirishima's engine rooms were flooded. Her steering was destroyed. Both forward turrets were gone. Her superstructure was collapsed. Fires raged throughout the ship, fed by ruptured fuel lines and exploding ammunition. She had taken on 3,700 tons of water and was listing 9 degrees to starboard. Admiral Kondo, aboard the heavy cruiser Atago, watched in horror as his battleship was systematically destroyed by an enemy he couldn't even see. He ordered the rest of his formation to retreat. At 0108 hours, less than 10 minutes after Washington opened fire, the entire Japanese force turned north and fled, leaving Kirishima behind. Washington didn't pursue. Admiral Lee had no destroyer screen left to protect him from torpedo attacks. Japanese submarines might be lurking in the area. And Washington herself was not undamaged. During the engagement, she had been struck by one shell from South Dakota's guns, friendly fire in the confusion. The shell hit Washington's starboard side and punched through her hull above the waterline without exploding. It was a minor wound, but it reminded Lee that his ship could be sunk by accident as easily as by enemy action. Lee reformed his battered task force and withdrew to the south. Behind him, Kuroshima burned through the early morning hours. Japanese destroyers approached several times to take off survivors, but the fires were so intense they couldn't get close. Finally, at 0320 hours, Admiral Kondo ordered Kuroshima scuttled. Her crew opened her seacocks and abandoned ship. She capsized at 0327 hours and slid beneath the waves, taking over 250 men with her. The last major Japanese naval attack on Guadalcanal was over. Dawn came slowly to Iron Bottom Sound on November 15, 1942. The waters were littered with debris, oil slicks, floating wreckage, life rafts carrying survivors from ships that no longer existed. The Japanese transport convoy that was supposed to land 7,000 troops on Guadalcanal had turned back during the night. Of the 11 transports, only 4 would reach the beach the next day. An American aircraft from Henderson Field destroyed all 4 as they attempted to unload. Fewer than 2,000 Japanese troops made it ashore, without heavy equipment, without artillery, without most of their supplies. The battle for Guadalcanal was essentially over. The Japanese would continue trying to supply and reinforce their garrison through destroyer runs for another 2 months, but the decisive moment had passed. Without battleship support, without the ability to neutralize Henderson Field, the Tokyo Express was just ferrying men to their deaths. By February 7, 1943, the Japanese High Command would authorize a complete evacuation. Over the next week, destroyers would successfully extract 10,852 men from Guadalcanal, starving, diseased, defeated men who had survived months of hell only to be pulled out in the night and sent to die on other islands. But the naval battle of Guadalcanal, particularly the engagement on the night of November 14 to 15, would echo far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. Because what happened that night forced the Japanese Navy to confront a truth it had been avoiding since Pearl Harbor, that the war they thought they were winning was already lost. The official Japanese after-action reports began arriving at Combined Fleet headquarters within days of the battle. They were clinical documents, filled with tables of damage, casualty figures, and tactical analyses. But between the lines, a note of something unfamiliar crept in. Not quite fear. Not quite despair. Something closer to bewilderment. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most accomplished destroyer captains and a veteran of dozens of surface actions, would later write about the confusion Japanese officers felt when they tried to reconstruct what had happened. The enemy seemed to possess some secret weapon, he recalled. Ships were being hit by accurate fire from targets they couldn't see. Ranges that should have been impossible for visual fire control were yielding perfect salvos. The Americans were somehow firing effectively in conditions where the Japanese optical superiority meant nothing. Commander Toshikazu Ami, a staff officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters who was assigned to analyze the Guadalcanal campaign, studied the reports with growing alarm. He interviewed survivors from Kuroshima. He examined the damage reports from other ships in Kondo's force. He plotted the movements of both fleets on the night of November 14. And he reached a conclusion that he would state baldly in his post-war analysis: the employment of radar by the United States completely reversed the Japanese Navy's traditional superiority in night engagements. This was more than tactical commentary. It was an epitaph for an entire strategic doctrine. The Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting night fighting. Their sailors trained constantly in low-light conditions. Their optics were the finest in the world, rangefinders that could detect targets at distances that astounded foreign observers. They had developed the long lance torpedo specifically to maximize their advantage in night engagements, creating a weapon with twice the range and 3 times the warhead of American torpedoes. They had won battle after battle in darkness, at Savo Island, at the Java Sea, in the waters around Guadalcanal itself. And radar had made all of it obsolete. But radar was only part of the story. What truly alarmed Japanese officers as they studied the aftermath of the naval battle of Guadalcanal was the glimpse it gave them into American industrial capacity. USS Washington had fired 75 16-inch shells in less than 7 minutes of actual firing time. That represented a rate of fire no one had thought possible from battleship main guns. It suggested logistics, ammunition production, and crew training at levels the Japanese couldn't match. And Washington was just one ship. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo indicated the Americans were building battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers at a pace that seemed impossible. The two battleships that had fought at Guadalcanal, Washington and South Dakota, had been commissioned only months before. They were the vanguard of a flood of new construction. 6 more battleships of the same class were either completed or under construction. 4 even larger battleships of the Iowa class were being built. Fleet carriers were sliding down the ways at a rate of 1 every few months. Light carriers were being converted from cruiser hulls. Destroyer production was measured in dozens per year. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned about this before the war. He had lived in America, had studied at Harvard, had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity in a way few other Japanese officers did. When questioned about the prospects for war with the United States, Yamamoto had reportedly said he could run wild for 6 months, but after that he had no confidence in ultimate victory. His private correspondence reveals an even bleaker assessment. He wrote that Japan could never match American industrial production and that a long war would inevitably favor the United States. By November 1942, Yamamoto's 6-month window had passed. The Battle of Midway in June had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August had damaged the carrier Ryujo and cost more aircraft. The Battle of Santa Cruz in October had damaged 2 more carriers and gutted their air groups. And now, at Guadalcanal, the Japanese had lost 2 battleships, Hai and Kurashima, in 3 days. Japan had begun the war with 10 battleships. It would end the war with the same 10 battleships, minus the 2 sunk at Guadalcanal and others lost later. The industrial capacity didn't exist to build more. Battleship construction required massive infrastructure, skilled labor, vast quantities of steel, and years of work. Japan's shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity, trying to replace the carriers and destroyers being sunk faster than they could be built. America, by contrast, was just getting started. In 1942, American shipyards launched 2 battleships, 3 fleet carriers, 1 light carrier, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 52 destroyers, and 27 submarines. In 1943, they would launch 3 battleships, 6 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, 3 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, 128 destroyers, and 55 submarines. In 1944, the numbers would increase again. Japanese officers studying these figures experienced what can only be described as mathematical horror. Commander Ami would later write that analyzing American production capacity was like watching an approaching tidal wave. Each month, intelligence reported more ships commissioned, more aircraft produced, more trained pilots completing training. The Americans were replacing their losses and expanding their fleet simultaneously. The Japanese were barely replacing losses and couldn't expand at all. But the shock went deeper than numbers. It was the quality that stunned them. Washington's radar wasn't just an advantage, it was a revolution. Japanese destroyer Captain Hara described trying to fight ships equipped with radar as fighting an enemy we could not see who could see us perfectly. Other officers compared it to fighting blind versus fighting sighted. After the war, when American occupation forces interviewed Japanese naval officers, the subject of radar came up repeatedly. Captain Atsushioi, who had commanded destroyers throughout the war, stated bluntly that the introduction of radar was the single most important factor in Japan's naval defeat. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had served as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, wrote that Japanese officers had known about radar theoretically but had completely underestimated its tactical applications. The Japanese had radar technology. They had experimented with it before the war. But they had never prioritized it. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized spiritual power, fighting spirit, and intensive training. Technology was important, but it was secondary to the quality of the men using it. This philosophy had served them well in their war with China and in the early months of the Pacific War. But it crumbled against an enemy who had both quality manpower and technological superiority. And the technology gap was widening. By 1943, American ships were being equipped with surface search radar that could detect targets at 35,000 yards. Fire control radar allowed accurate firing at ranges exceeding 25,000 yards. Fighter aircraft were being fitted with airborne intercept radar that allowed them to find and shoot down enemy bombers at night. American submarines had radar that allowed them to attack on the surface in darkness with near impunity. The Japanese response was too little, too late. They attempted to develop improved radar sets, but production was hampered by material shortages and bombing of industrial facilities. By 1944, some Japanese ships had basic radar, but it was generations behind American equipment. And by then, it didn't matter. The American numerical advantage was so overwhelming that technology was almost beside the point. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact on Japanese officers who understood the implications was profound. They had entered the war believing in Japanese superiority, spiritual, tactical, and moral. They had been taught that Western materialism made Americans soft, unwilling to endure hardship, prone to surrender when faced with determined resistance. The early victories had seemed to confirm this. American forces had been driven from the Philippines, from Wake Island, from the Dutch East Indies. Allied fleets had been mauled in the Java Sea and at Savo Island. But Guadalcanal revealed the truth. The Americans didn't quit. They took staggering losses and came back for more. They lost ships and built more ships. They lost aircraft and built more aircraft. They lost men and trained more men. The attrition the Japanese had counted on to wear down American morale was working in reverse. Each loss made the Americans more determined. Each setback increased industrial production. Each defeat was analyzed, studied, and corrected. Vice Admiral Matomagaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto, kept a detailed diary throughout the war. His entry for November 16, 1942, the day after Washington sank Hiroshima, is telling. He wrote that the loss of 2 battleships in 3 days was a grave blow, but more concerning was the enemy's ability to replace losses at a rate we cannot match. He noted that American industrial capacity was proving to be as formidable as predicted and that Japan must find a way to equalize the material imbalance through superior tactics and spirit. But how do you equalize radar with spirit? How do you overcome industrial capacity with determination? These were questions Japanese strategic planners couldn't answer. Some advocated for a defensive strategy, husbanding resources, and forcing the Americans to pay such a high price for each island that they would eventually negotiate a peace. Others pushed for aggressive operations designed to destroy the American fleet in a decisive battle, a reprise of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in 1905. Yamamoto fell into the latter camp. In April 1943, he launched Operation Igo, a massive air offensive against Allied positions in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. The operation was supposed to destroy Allied air power and shipping, creating conditions for a naval counteroffensive. Instead, it cost Japan nearly 200 aircraft and their crews, losses the Japanese couldn't replace. Yamamoto himself was killed on April 18, 1943, when American P-38 fighters, vectored to intercept his transport plane by radio intelligence that had decrypted Japanese codes, shot down his aircraft over Bougainville. The death of Yamamoto was symbolic. He had been the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who understood America better than almost any other Japanese officer, and the one leader who might have navigated Japan toward a negotiated peace before complete catastrophe. His death removed the last senior officer who truly grasped the impossibility of Japan's strategic position. His replacement, Admiral Manichi Koga, inherited a fleet that was bleeding to death. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan would lose 3 carriers and over 600 aircraft. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan would commit virtually its entire remaining surface fleet and lose 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. By the end of 1944, the Japanese Navy existed primarily as a collection of immobile training ships, trapped in home waters by fuel shortages and American submarines. And through it all, the words of officers like Commander Ami echoed through headquarters briefings and staff studies: radar changed everything. American industrial capacity changed everything. The war we thought we were fighting wasn't the war we were actually in. There's a photograph taken on the deck of USS Washington shortly after the battle. It shows sailors clustered around one of the 16-inch gun turrets, examining the breech mechanisms and checking for damage. The guns are elevated slightly, barrels still dark with powder residue from the night's firing. The sailors look exhausted but satisfied, the expression of men who have done an impossible thing and survived. None of them know, in that moment, what they've accomplished beyond the immediate tactical victory. They don't know that historians will later call the naval battle of Guadalcanal the turning point in the Pacific War's naval campaign. They don't know that Washington's engagement against Hiroshima will be studied in naval academies for generations as a textbook example of radar-directed fire. They don't know that Japanese officers will spend the rest of the war trying to counter a technology gap they can't close and an industrial advantage they can't match. They only know they faced a superior Japanese force in darkness and won. Admiral Lee's tactical decisions that night would become legendary. His positioning of Washington at the rear of the column, allowing her to use radar without being blinded by friendly muzzle flashes. His patience in holding fire while his destroyers were destroyed, waiting for the perfect moment. His use of radar to track targets through smoke and darkness. His decision to break off the engagement before risking his ship in pursuit of a beaten enemy. Every choice was correct. Every judgment was sound. Lee would go on to command battleship divisions throughout the rest of the Pacific War. He would participate in the assault on the Marshall Islands, the Marianas Campaign, and operations off the Philippines. He would die of a heart attack on August 25, 1945, aboard the USS Wyoming in the Atlantic, just days after the Japanese surrender. He was 57 years old. The Navy named a destroyer after him, USS Willis A. Lee, DD-929, commissioned in 1954. Captain Glenn Davis, Washington's commanding officer, would receive the Navy Cross for his actions on November 15. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism, outstanding leadership, and superb seamanship. Davis would go on to command the battleship USS Alabama and later serve in various staff positions before retiring as a rear admiral. USS Washington herself would serve throughout the rest of the war, participating in nearly every major American offensive in the Pacific. She would provide fire support for amphibious landings, screen carrier task forces, and shelled Japanese positions from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. She would survive the war without losing a single man to enemy action, a remarkable record for a ship that spent 4 years in combat zones. After the war, she would be decommissioned in 1947 and eventually scrapped in 1961. Parts of her survive. Her bell is at the University of North Carolina, her main mast stands at the Washington State Capitol in Olympia. Her name was given to a ballistic missile submarine, USS Washington, SSBN 598, which served from 1961 to 1992. But Washington's real legacy wasn't the steel of her hull or the commemorative artifacts in museums. It was what she proved on that night in November 1942. She proved that American technology, American industrial capacity, and American crews trained to use that technology effectively could defeat any enemy, regardless of that enemy's spiritual superiority or tactical experience. She proved that radar could revolutionize naval warfare. And she proved that the Japanese Navy's dominance of night actions was an illusion that would shatter the moment it encountered an enemy who could see in the dark. The Japanese officers who wrote about American firepower after Guadalcanal weren't just commenting on superior gunnery. They were acknowledging the end of a strategic paradigm. The war they had planned for, a war of decisive fleet actions where Japanese training and determination would overcome American material advantages, was never going to happen. The war they got was one of industrial attrition, technological advancement, and mathematical inevitability. It was a war they couldn't win, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they lacked shipyards, steel mills, oil fields, and radar factories. Commander Ami, in his post-war writings, reflected on this with remarkable clarity. He wrote that the Japanese Navy entered the war with a 19th-century understanding of 20th-century warfare. They believed in Mahani and decisive battles, in the spiritual power of the warrior, in the superiority of intensive training over mechanical assistance. "We trained our men to see in the dark," he wrote. "The Americans build machines that saw for them." In retrospect, it seems obvious which approach would prevail. At the time, it was heresy to suggest machines could replace Japanese fighting spirit. There's a bitter irony in the fact that some of the clearest-eyed assessments of American industrial and technological superiority came from the Japanese officers who had fought against it and lost. They understood, perhaps better than many Americans at the time, what American factories and laboratories had accomplished. They had seen it from the receiving end, the radar that tracked them in darkness, the shells that found them despite smoke and confusion, the ships that kept coming no matter how many were sunk. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki, a gunnery officer who survived multiple actions around Guadalcanal, wrote in his memoir, "We thought we were fighting the Americans. We were actually fighting American industry. Every ship we sank was replaced by 2 more. Every aircraft we shot down was replaced by 3 more. We were not losing to sailors. We were losing to factories." This realization came too late to change Japanese strategy. By the time senior leadership fully grasped the scale of the industrial imbalance, there was nothing they could do about it. Japan had committed to a war it couldn't win, against an enemy whose productive capacity was 50 times its own, whose oil production was 500 times greater, whose steel production was 12 times larger. The mathematics were inexorable. The outcome was determined not by courage or tactics but by blast furnaces, assembly lines, and industrial capacity. In the end, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, and specifically USS Washington's destruction of Kuroshima, represented a pivot point not just in the campaign for Guadalcanal but in the entire Pacific War. After this battle, the strategic initiative passed permanently to the United States. The Japanese would continue fighting, would continue inflicting casualties, would continue dying by the tens of thousands for islands and atolls that ultimately didn't matter. But they would never again threaten American control of the sea. The men who fought on Washington that night didn't know they were making history. They were doing their jobs, tracking targets on radar scopes, loading shells into breeches, adjusting fire control solutions, steering their ship through darkness while explosions lit the night around them. But their work that night, multiplied by the work of thousands of other sailors on hundreds of other ships, supported by millions of workers in American shipyards and factories, defined the outcome of the war. The Japanese generals and admirals who wrote about American firepower after Guadalcanal weren't exaggerating or making excuses. They were bearing witness to a transformation in warfare, from an era where training and elan could overcome material disadvantages to an era where technology and industry determined outcomes before the first shot was fired. They were watching their own obsolescence in real time, reading radar plots and damage reports and production figures that spelled out their defeat in mathematical certainty. And perhaps that's the most profound lesson of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Wars are not won by courage alone, or by superior tactics, or by fighting spirit, as essential as those qualities are. Wars between industrial powers are won by factories. They're won by engineers designing radar sets and fire control computers. They're won by workers building ships faster than they can be sunk. They're won by logisticians ensuring ammunition reaches the front. They're won by trainers producing competent crews. They're won by the vast, unglamorous machinery of industrial production that translates economic power into military victory. The Japanese understood this too late. Their officers' writings after the war are filled with a kind of stunned recognition of what they had faced. They had gone to war believing that will could triumph over matter. They discovered that when the material disparity reached a certain threshold, will became irrelevant. You cannot outspirit radar. You cannot outcourage assembly lines. You cannot overcome shipyards with determination. One American battleship sank 4 Japanese destroyers and crippled a battleship in 7 minutes of firing because that American battleship represented the entire industrial and technological might of the United States, the radar laboratories, the gun foundries, the steel mills, the training programs, the logistical networks, the scientific research, the engineering expertise, and the productive capacity that could turn all of that into functional weapons systems faster than any enemy could. Destroy them. That was the real firepower Japanese generals wrote about. Not just the 16-inch guns, but everything behind them. And it was unstoppable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.